that many people would ask is, who pays the higher price of Fairtrade? You know, can you pass that on to consumers? Do you bury it in your own profit margins? Do you pass it back down the chain? Where does the cost go, if there is a cost?
Premium partly is passed on to the consumer, but there's margin, I guess, that absorbs some of that in the margin, depending on what, if you have a premium product, or so the tiering of our brands. If you look at them, so home brand is an entry level product. So if there is any Fairtrade in that has premium, we'd probably have to absorb that in the margin. But if we have a macro brand that's Fairtrade, that is a premium brand, it does have a little bit more room with the margin to play. So it depends on the tiering of the product.
Hi, I'm Beth Patterson from Panellists. It's a question for Molly. Molly, you mentioned that there are 8 companies that control the supply chain. Interested in where Esther's cocoa beans go once they're bought.
Well, of course, Fairtrade's whole point is to break that. So Fairtrade products are bought by a variety of companies. So where do you send your beans to? Where do your beans get crushed, do you know?
After we process the cocoa and we pack them and the vehicle come for it, they normally send it to the cocoa board. And Fairtrade come and pick some from the cocoa board. We are having a sticker indicating that the cocoa is from our company, Gapa Cocoa. So Fairtrade picks some, and Divine Chocolates Company also come to pick some.
Does being part of Fairtrade oblige you or require you to farm differently at all?
Yeah, the impact of Fairtrade is really encouraging us to farm more, and also we get so many money, and we are able to buy material, colors and other things to expand our farm. So it's more, we get more excited, and then we are encouraged, and then we are proud of being cocoa farmers. So we are expanding our cocoa. Me, for instance, I have gotten the chance to expand my farm, and I want to be an intensive cocoa farmer, and I know that with the help of Fairtrade, I'll be able to achieve my goals in future.
This is actually an exceptional thing, because if we look at the average age of farming communities, I think in Latin America it's 54, in other parts of the world there are many, many parts, and the vast majority of the world's produce right across the board is produced in many of these countries, and the age of farmers is going up and up and up, and many communities don't retain the next generation in farming. And that's actually true almost everywhere. So the idea that actually you would love cocoa farming and you would want to stay on your farm is really, I mean, that gives me chills, because that's actually what we as a planet need. We really need to figure out how to make this a thriving, viable business.
Thanks for that.
Just a question here. Simon Soljo from Allen's. One of the things that has been in the press, I suppose, over time is questions about what share of the premium that we pay for Fairtrade or other certified products actually goes to the farmers. I'm just wondering whether your organisation has looked at that. So if we're in a supermarket and looking at bars of chocolate, and the Fairtrade bar of chocolate is $1 more, how is that dollar split between various chains, and how much of that would go to Esther?
100% of the premium goes to Esther. So the premium and the tradable commodity are all what go directly to the farmer. What funds the kind of back end, if you will, of what Fairtrade does is actually the use of the mark on products. So the licensing fees that the market pays are what supports the back end. And then we get a very substantial amount of donor support. So for instance, all of the work that we've been able to do in Africa in the last 5 years was supported by a couple of key organizations, DFID, Irish Aid, a whole group of Nordic aid countries, and then a group in the UK called Comic Relief, who invested $5 million with Fairtrade to bring Africa up and the producers in Africa up. So 100% of the premium goes to the producers, 100% of the traded product goes to the producers, the license fee is what sort of supports the market end, which is as it should be. That's where we're trying to market the products. That's where we're trying to educate consumers to make them aware of why buying the product matters. So that's a pretty simple answer.
So another question here.
Yeah, sorry, it's another question for Molly. I work in the coffee industry, and we have a Fairtrade product. It's been kind of one of our products which we increasingly kind of find difficult to kind of get any traction on. We come up against fully sustainable, direct trade, fully traceable coffee, Rainforest Alliance. One of the challenges we face is that we sometimes hear the phrase coined, fair trade isn't fair. One of the objections that comes up is that the farmers have to pay a kind of license fee. Sometimes that license fee is actually kind of inhibited that's then getting into the fair trade process. I'm just wondering if you could put some perspective around that.
Yes, there's a few myths going around. Farmers don't pay a license fee. What farmers have to do is adhere to and be accredited by the certification system. So the certification system is what I would call the backbone or the spine of everything that enables that trust. So all those issues that are related to democracy and governance and what is required in order to properly account for the expenditure of the premium, for instance, those are big issues in democracy building that are actually quite complex, and they're embedded in the standards. Wage equity, gender equity issues, no child labor, various environmental standards, all of that is in the certification. The certification has to be paid for, and what Fairtrade does is cross-subsidize in many, many ways to try to bring that price of certification down. The other systems that are out there, so maybe you mentioned Rainforest and UTZ, those are important systems. They are independently certified and they are third-party verified. My personal view would be that actually that's probably better than someone just saying, I buy my beans from one. There's no way for us to test that. It might be fantastic. It might be the best thing in the whole wide world, but unless it's transparently done, who could possibly say? So I think, and the other thing that's been a little argy-bargy is, we used to trade with only, tiny, small traders, and we now have grown into a position where we are trying to change the global economy. So right now, are what we would call our alternative traders, which are our pioneers and the ones that we really have the biggest place in our heart for, because they're the brave ones that actually got out there and tried to work with these farmers in the very beginning to make all of this happen. That is only now about 10% of global trade in fair trade for our system, fair trade products. So the question we have to ask is, would we give up that other 90% of benefits for the farmers and make the perfect the enemy of the good? We have to find our way in that, because of course, when big companies take on something like fair trade, when a Cadbury takes on something like fair trade, it does put pressure on some of the smaller traders. And it is something that we have to figure out. And yesterday I was really, really interested to learn that a company like Divine Chocolate is a really interesting example, because they've been absolutely, just doing unbelievably wonderful work. A Cadbury comes in, and of course that's making this massive impact and benefit for the farmers, because that's that other 90%. What is it that we can do for the Divine to make that work better? And we just learned the other day that actually 50% of Divine Chocolate is owned by the Cocoa Cooperative, which is amazing. And it turns out that happened because the Rodericks, the body shop, actually donated their half of Divine Chocolate to them. So they're benefiting in multiple ways by Divine Chocolate. But these are challenges of an evolving and growing system that is kind of getting to, it's getting bigger, and it means that there are a variety of challenges. But, the fact that we're working with big companies, with big multinational companies, I think is a fantastic thing, because what that means is that we are actually transforming this global economy. And if we stay with only the tiny ones who we love and adore and support and want to figure out how to make them more successful too, we'll never be able to have the impact for the farmers. So what I say is that we have to base all of our decisions on evidence. So if a direct trader is not being independently verified and not being willing to be transparent in their transactions, to me that's worse than Nestle not being transparent. I mean, it's the same thing really. So we have to be evidence-based. We have to let whoever, big or small, wants to play in the fair trade field to play on the same rules and to hopefully succeed.
Ben talked a lot about the tension between competitive pricing and responsibility. And I wonder if you could give us an insight how that plays out inside a major corporation. and your interactions with your CFO and other colleagues on where does sustainability fit and how does it fit in given all these competitive pressures?
I guess internally we've made a number of commitments which are now public in our responsible sourcing practices and policies, and one of them is the issue of working conditions and human rights, which has been in place for quite a few years now, since 2008, and probably a great contributor to the fact that we weren't involved in those kinds of practices that we heard Ben mentioned in Bangladesh and elsewhere. And we have a very small volume in Bangladesh, exactly for that reason, because we can't actually be sure that we have a good handle on that risk. And we still buy a lot of our products from China, which is a much more sophisticated market, has its own problems, but nowhere near Bangladesh in terms of the risks. So the issues around pricing and how we absorb that price, premiums, or what we do for different levels of brands, that all needs to be worked out in a company that is a for-profit company. We have shareholders who expect particular returns. And I think to some of the points that Ben made before, we all have responsibilities and we behave differently as investors, as consumers, as a member of the community. And like you, where you have those conflicts in your head about how do you behave in different ways. If you're an investor, you want a good return. If you're a consumer, you want convenience, cheap price, whatever. And if you're the community, you want everybody to do the right thing. We have the same issues internally. We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our consumers. We don't think, and our shareholders and our suppliers and our people, and we don't think that people necessarily buy from us because we are ethical. But we know that they may stop buying from us if they felt we weren't doing the right thing. So it's just slightly changing that. It's a slight twist in that, the way we look at it, because we do know that something happens in Bangladesh, our sales don't get affected, but we do know that people don't like that kind of a company being associated with that kind of negativity. And we get a lot of letters, a lot of phone calls, and it's a process that is, to the efficient operation of a company, is a bit disruptive. So you really want to keep away from anything like that as much as possible, and the processes are put in place for exactly that reason. I know that Ben mentioned issues around auditing, and that's sort of hiding behind things. Audits are quite a useful tool. They're not the only tool that we use, or many other companies. That's only one tool and one method. And they do help you understand what sort of issues there might be, because those audit processes include worker interviews outside of management control. So you actually get to interview people and understand what are the issues individually, but in a group. So those interviews and conversations with the workers are quite helpful in understanding, actually, apart from the day you were there, what happens in that place. And then we do also have local NGOs that help us in gauging, using investigative methods, engaging what actually happens on the days that you're not there auditing things. Mm-hmm. And that sort of helps you when you go to next supplier conversation to be able to point out some of the things and emphasise what are the things that you'd like to see, what good looks like, and what is it that you're looking for. Without threatening to terminate, because that's the worst thing, because everything goes underground and they don't show you anything. But it's those conversations, and the more we consolidate our supplier base, the more we're actually able to invest time and effort in those suppliers to bring their, to upskill them, to build capacity. But there's no getting away from the fact that if there is corruption in a country, and some countries face significant corruption, the Rana plazas would still happen. And that isn't because the retailer or the brand isn't paying enough money. That's because an inspector who went to inspect that building is corrupt, took money and certified a building that shouldn't have been certified. No amount of increased pay from a retailer would fix that problem. So everyone has to work together. The governments in those countries have a responsibility for good governance. That's what they're there. They're not playing their role. And the sorts of things like the Accord are very useful because they hold those governments accountable as well as the retailers. So it's not about just one party. Everyone plays a role in that whole process. And in terms of, bring back to your question about how those sort of arguments or debates play out in the company, they take time, and it's a learning process, and we all go through that. But we know that at the end, there's an investment we have to make to first do the right thing because people expect us to do that, and secondly, because we want a continued supply, and also because we have a reputation and a brand to protect. So they're key things for us.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question, if I may, for Ben. Just building on what Armineh has said about the need for better governance, the potential of corporate responsibility, the need for consumers to take action. But Ben, you didn't talk about workers and farmers organizing themselves. And historically, the union movement dealt with a lot of these things. In international markets, that's really hard. But I'm wondering if you see signs of any attempts by workers to organize, mobilize, unionize to deal with these issues?
Look, in a country like Bangladesh, that's very, very difficult. There are strict laws against workers organising, and I can give you a dissertation on the number of union organisers in Bangladesh who've faced violence, who've simply disappeared, these sorts of things. It is, in a lot of ways, and I found myself agreeing with everything Armineh said. There is a real spectrum of behaviour in a market like Bangladesh. There are a lot of companies who go in and work very well and work very responsibly, but there are some real cowboys out there. And in those sort of factories, the option to unionise is very, very difficult, and in fact very, very dangerous to try and do something like that. So that is, again, I think this goes to Armineh's point as well about government responsibility. But that's the Bangladeshi government is very weak, and the garment industry is very, very powerful. And has enormous influence on the way the government behaves and what the government's able to do. So it's a political entity in itself, the garment industry, and that needs to be understood. So simply saying, why don't these workers unionise, it's a far more complex problem than that.
Thanks. Molly?
Just to follow on from that, this has been... and what I was thinking is, as Armineh was speaking too, how important it is that we find partnerships to do these sorts of things, because providing some independent cover. So in Fairtrade standards, for instance, there is a hired labour standard, and any farmer, any collective, any garment workers that are working under a Fairtrade system would have to allow freedom of association. And the hired labour standards are built into, again, that certification system. So it's easy to do that as fair trade, separate from the other mechanisms that are legal, whereas it would be almost impossible for someone like Woolies to come in and demand that. We can demand that because we're working with only selected people that are choosing to work with us. So we can set standards that enable that kind of freedom of association. But even we are having challenges in a country like China, where, for instance, in the cotton issue, almost all cotton in the supply chain at some point ends up in China, and we are at the moment trying to work through what are the ways that we can figure out how to do that in a healthy way. But embedding these standards in the certification and requiring that from all of the people that we work with is, I'm sure, well actually you can probably speak from Kwapakoko's point of view, because some of these issues come up again and again, and from our point of view, it's not about shutting down the factory or shutting down the plantation. It's actually about how do we help get the children into school? How do we help get people to the position where they're powerful enough as an entity that they can collectively make decisions that have some weight with their employers? These are sort of iterative challenges, and the point isn't to shut the thing down or have people disappear. The point is to empower them to be able to take control of their situations and of their lives. But when it's embedded in the standards, it's easier.
And it's important,
so we can do that.
It's important that in the desire to do things better, and we don't go there to another country and apply our expectations and our standards, because we've arrived at this point through years of development, and make sure that there are not consequences that we didn't want, like endangering people's lives by insisting that there should be a union, and
Exactly.
they're subject to illegal practice, and they disappear.
Exactly.
Like it's happening.
Well, we have a great example right now happening in Fiji with sugar. So we have a government in Fiji that has banned unions basically effectively across everything. And so we've got a lot of sugar farmers in cooperatives in Fiji, and it's extremely difficult because the ILO, Amnesty International want to run campaigns against Fiji. Well, we support the need to have the labor unions and the ability to organize in Fiji. The problem is we don't want to put the poor farmers in the middle of this grand debate. So we had a situation very recently where one of our cooperatives was suspended, or about to be suspended, for governance issues. So we had to go in and sort of help them to have a new General Assembly. They had a chairman that wouldn't leave, and there were a bunch of governance issues that were happening. So they then, as an organization, as a cooperative, have to explain to Fairtrade why they're having these governance issues and how they're going to get around it. So, but it's, as you say, it's not like we're coming in to tell them how to do something. It's that we're setting a standard of, you have to have democratic elections. The decisions have to be transparent. We don't back any particular horse, but if you've locked out your chief executive and you're not allowing elections because you don't want to give up the chairmanship, there's a problem. So these are the sorts of things where we're helping to have democracy and these sorts of transparent processes embedded without coming head to head with the government on whether or not they allow unions. So it's a subtle but educative difference in enabling people to take more control and to understand what the difference is. But it's a very difficult situation for us in many cases because, again, the government's banned all unions. If the ILO and Amnesty decide to run a big campaign in Fiji, there are a lot of really poor farmers that are going to be stuck in the middle of that. And how we navigate that is a constant challenge.
We could discuss this all day, but I'm conscious of time and that people probably have other things to get on to, including our panel. But if there's one or two additional questions here, somebody wants to jump in. Yes, you've got your mic, go for it.
Hi, Sebastian. I used to work for a major US corporation. I've got a question. We very hear often the message, consumer want cheaper price, and sometimes it feels like we're sort of neglecting how smart the consumer can be, and I guess the success of Fairtrade is an example of that. And well, consumer then probably walk in the shop and he thinks, well, I've heard I want a cheaper price, so I'm just looking for the cheaper price. And having heard some farmer talk about home brand products in supermarkets, they sort of mentioned that it's actually probably the worst outcome for them. That's where they're getting the smaller margin. And from that perspective, I would be interested to know, considering that probably the consumer are smarter, when are we going to see a fair trade product in a home brand, for example, type of product?
We have it now. I'm not quite sure. I agree, consumers are smart. I never suggested consumers weren't smart. And that's exactly why they don't want us to preach to them. And they like the information. They will make the choices. They don't want the retailer to tell them how they should be shopping. But there are lots of families who are on budget, and fair trade, frankly, doesn't rate anywhere on their priorities. I'm sorry that that's the case, but that is the case. I can't make that decision because, fortunately, I've got a good job and I get paid more than the average wages. So perhaps I can go and buy fair trade, but it's not fair to impose that on a lot of families that are not in that space. But that doesn't mean that just because it's not fair trade, therefore there is exploitation. You can do other things to make sure that that at least people have decent working conditions, that they're not endangering their lives every day they go to work. So we're talking about different things. Fair trade is a certification process that pays premium. Yes, it's probably the ideal, and that's what we want to get to. But today, we can't do that for every product.
And also, we're talking about an evolution. So, today, if you tried to buy a single glazed window in California, it would be twice as expensive as a double glazed window, because you had to have a critical demand to get the supply up to bring the cost down. So fair trade is like a way of transforming a market. Once you get the supply and the demand up, then the price regulates back down to something that everyone else can afford. But it's certainly true that not everyone can afford fair trade. There is a real price to consumption, and so it is but I would say have hope. What we're doing is transforming the market, and it does take time. And eventually the double glazed windows are cheaper than the single glazed windows.
Thanks for that. I think we should probably bring this session to a close. I think we've seen the importance of mobilizing the workers and farmers, but also the need to mobilize the consumer and realize the latent power that consumers have and maybe don't wield as much as they could. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Esther, Molly, Armineh, and Ben, for really stimulating thoughts and comments.